kitchen table was draped with a yellow tablecloth and set with heaping dishes of food. The room was warm and bright. Through cracks in the curtains you could see the bluish snow in the yard outside. At my mother's request, I'd set place cards written in my finest calligraphy on each plate. My parents and my Aunt Wendy sat at the head of the table, along with some of my cousins. My Uncle Rick and his new girlfriend Billy sat at the middle of the table, opposite my brother Elliot and me. Our grandparents were placed at the other end. Everyone settled in and without preamble began eating. Compliments rang out to my mother and her sister, and calls to pass food carried around the table. But before I'd even gravied my potatoes, Billy was at me again. "So what will you do when you graduate, Chrissy?" Billy was a thin Kathleen Hanna look-alike, tucked into a strapless black dress. She had pink stripes in her black hair and a Valley Girl accent. I disliked her. She didn't fit with my uncle. But I hated it when people called me Chrissy. I was always Chris. I gave my uncle a look and took the bowl of potatoes from my grandfather. "Get a master's in lit," I said, nose up a little. "Atta girl," Rick said. "Going to teaching, right? Not a lot else to do with an English degree." He shook his bald head. "That's not true. You could always go into law school." "Uncle Rick." Yeah, all I'm saying is you're going to have to start worrying about making a living soon." "I always wanted to teach," Billy cut in. "I love little kids. If I hadn't gotten into acting, I was planning on teaching college, actually." I took a long sip of my wine. "Oh," Billy said, looking down at her plate. Uncle Rick looked at Billy and then back at me, a little flustered. Then he smiled, trying to downplay the awkwardness. "Hey, Elliot," he called across the table to my brother. "Pass those rolls, huh?" Elliot held the tray out, then pulled it back, wagging his forehead. "These rolls?" "Oh, just give me those, you punk," Rick said, and leaned across the table to grab the dish. As his hand reached the bowl, a small bag of white powder slipped from his breast pocket and landed softly on the tablecloth. "Holy shit," my brother said. Billy gave a little squeak. Everyone's head turned towards the baggie next to the basket of rolls. I realized in a flash that it was cocaine, like on Law & Order or something. The room became dead silent. I looked down the table at my cousin Sam, who had a huge pile of mashed potatoes balanced on his fork, halfway to his mouth. When he set it back onto his plate, my mother stood up. "That's it! Get that off of my table, get out of my house! Rick, get out!" She slammed her open palm on the table. The crockery quivered. She knocked her wine glass, dousing her full plate of turkey and stuffing, turning her mashed potatoes pink. My father threw down his napkin. "God damn it, Rick, it's Thanksgiving, for Christ's sake." My uncle's usually pale face was now beet red. His lips hung slack, his eyes downcast. Beads of sweat popped out along his forehead. Billy was wide-eyed, her mouth a bright red O. I wondered which of them would reach for the cocaine first. "Out," my mother said, pointing towards the door. I looked left. My grandfather's mouth hung open, his shaggy gray eyebrows still fixed on the bag. My grandmother was looking down, her hand shaking. My father stood up now and glared at his brother-in-law, his mustache twitching. "God, what happened to you, Rick?" I wondered too. I'd suspected for years that my uncle had developed a habit, but until I saw that baggie come out, I'd never been totally sure. It was a year after his divorce when I first noticed changes, my freshman year at UW. When I came home to Port Townsend from Seattle at Thanksgiving, I was shocked to see Uncle Rick without the paunch he'd carried since I was a little girl. He looked like a different person. He still spoke in the same booming voice, criticizing Boeing's business tactics, asking untactful questions about the boys at school. Something deeper was off, though. He seemed nervous, not just his usual hyper-energetic self. In the back of my mind, I considered the wild fantasy that he paid a doppelganger to have Thanksgiving with us while he boosted up with prostitutes in Seattle. At Christmas, I made up similar fantasies, wrote them into J. McInerney, knockoff short stories. He called that year, though, greeting everyone, saying he had to be in New York on business. For the 5 minutes I talked to him, he sounded fine. But on Easter, we heard nothing, and after that, there were no more visits or calls to my parents' house. Then, after not hearing from him for 3 months, he called me on spring break to say he'd sold his house in Queen Anne and was living in a luxury suite in the West End. He said to stop by when I had time off for studying. He didn't call my parents, and I had to relay the new address. A month later, he called again, this time on a Friday night, and invited me and my girlfriends to dinner with his stockbroker buddies. So we dressed up and took my little Fiat down to the Luke. We were 19-year-old giggly and awestruck by the fancy wine and Armani suits. Uncle Rick and his friends bought us drinks. We flicked our hair, listened to their stockbroker stories, and enjoyed the attention, knowing we weren't obligated to do anything but be eye candy. The next day, when I got back to the dorm after class, my roommate, Charlotte, was waiting for me. She confided that one of my uncle's friends had invited her to try a little pick-me-up in the bathroom. I was so angry. It wasn't that it was a hard drug so much, but the intent behind the offer. I called my uncle, and he got irate on the phone, vowing to beat in the head of Philip, that dumb, worthless little prick, co-worker or not. Uncle Rick apologized and explained that some of his friends had a little habit typical of stockbrokers. Immediately after the call, I felt better. Uncle Rick hadn't known about the offer and sounded as angry as I was. But as I explained this to Charlotte over lunch, I realized he was hiding something. It was in the way he'd exploded almost before I'd finished telling the story. Like he was angry, but angry that I had found out, not that it had happened. I could tell just by the timing in his outburst, the over-seriousness in his threats. He was my favorite uncle, after all. When he was around, he never missed an opportunity to instigate a pillow fight or play pranks on my brother. He took us on trips. Once he took Elliot and me to a friend's cabin on Hood's Canal for New Year's Eve, and we ate fresh crab and shot fireworks. Another summer we went hiking around Mount Rainier. One clear day before the Emmons Glacier, we could see all the way to Seattle. I still have the picture up in my room. The three of us standing on the snowy mountainside, dark evergreens below, turquoise sky above. My brother and I in yellow windbreakers, Uncle Rick grinning his big grin, his bald head bright crimson. But after that night at the Loop, we didn't see him anymore. Excuses at the winter holidays. But Rick had always worked endlessly in order to survive at his job, so that was no excuse. It had never kept him before. My mother guessed he was probably taking drugs with his stockbroker friends. I never told her what happened at the Loop. I didn't want to believe about the drugs, and I put my hope in a girlfriend. I assumed he had women around, but we were all still waiting to hear about something serious. But I knew, as well as anyone, that my Aunt May had been special. Had losing her driven him into cocaine abuse? Watching him gape at that bag on the table, I thought back to their wedding. My Aunt May was a petite school teacher Rick had met on vacation in Saigon. In her close-fitting silk gown, she glowed, and my uncle's eyes had shined back at hers. He'd been calm, too, very unlike Rick, and we'd all assumed he'd finally found the right woman. Someone who'd convinced him he didn't have to prove himself against the memory of his workaholic, neglectful father. At the Thanksgiving after the wedding, at this very same table, that calmness had still been there. May had fit right in, and we'd all liked her. She was smart, considerate, and told wonderful stories about her travels in Southeast Asia. What had happened to pull Uncle Rick back to his obsessive work? What had made him push May away? Was he remembering now the night during that first year when he decided to stay at the office instead of going home to his wife? The night that would lead to their divorce 4 years later? Was he remembering that now and hoping for a reprieve that would never come? But why shouldn't it, I thought? Why shouldn't this man, as trapped his foibles by any, be given another chance? While my mother stood with index finger towards the door, the bag of cocaine levitated up on its own to eye level. Its plastic sheath blinked away, and the fine particles of dust exploded outward in glowing embers as bright as 4th of July sparklers. These sparks cascaded over us and stuck to our skin, warm as midday sunshine. They glowed on our arms, faces, the plates and glasses. For a moment I could not see for the brightness. Then the dots of plasma rose up, wreathed their heads in circlets of light. They twinkled there for a moment before fading away, rising towards the ceiling. I looked back down, saw my uncle had lost 10 years of age. His black hair stood thicker around his head. His jacket fit more tightly, the beginning of a potbelly at his midsection. Billy was gone, her chair empty. My mother's glass was full, her plate dry. My mother blinked rapidly and slowly set her glass down. "Oh, that's better," she said, and took a sip of wine. Everyone was quiet for a moment. Then my father spoke. "Rick, I gotta tell you, I'm really glad Billy's gone. You know she only wanted your money. She was such a loser, Uncle Rick." I said, "How'd you ever give the failed actress? And she was a druggie," my mother said. I know, Rick put his hands up. "You're all right. What can I say? My heart hasn't been in the right place after May." "Rick, look at you," my mother said. "I didn't lose 10 years of my Thanksgiving miracle. I'm grateful I got out of the hospital, but still." "It's true, Uncle Rick," I said. "You look really sharp." "Thanks, Chris," he said, nodding, as if embarrassed by his new look. "You know, May might take you back now that you're cleaned up." "Oh, well, I suppose I could call her, see how she's doing." "Well, Rick, you have to. She's the best thing that ever happened to you. This is your second chance." He nodded, his big teeth flashing. "All right, Chris, I will. I'll call." From the living room came the loud ring of my parents' phone. "I got it," Rick said, and dashed from the table.